Fablehaven, Chapter 18, Bahumat. By the time Kendra reached the barn, a pre-day gray dominated the eastern horizon. Her journey from the pond had been uneventful. Not a drop had spilled from the silver bowl. She went around to the little door Seth had kicked open and ducked inside. The Titanic cow stood munching hay from the loft. Every time Kendra saw Viola, she marveled anew at her enormity. The cow's udder was bloated, nearly as badly as the first time they had milked her. Kendra had the tears. Now she needed milk and blood. Since the Fairy Queen had been communicating mentally, Kendra trusted her first impressions. The milk would have to be Viola's. And the blood? Her own? The cow's? Probably both to be safe. Maybe both were required, but first the milk. Kendra set the silver bowl in a protected corner and retrieved one of the ladders. She had intended to still only a few squirts. There was no time for a proper milking. Kendra had never tried to collect Viola's milk. She and Seth had simply been relieving pressure for the cow and letting it spill all over the floor. There were plenty of barrels, but trying to dump a barrel into a little silver bowl seemed tricky. And considering that she would be sliding down a teat to get the milk out, it seemed like it would be hard to avoid falling in the barrel herself. She located a large pie tin, the kind Dell used to leave milk around the yard. Perfect. Small enough to dodge, but big enough to catch all the milk she would need. She positioned the tin under the teat, trying to estimate where the milk would squirt. Kendra climbed the ladder and jumped, embracing the fleshy teat. Milk gushed to the floor. Only a little splashed into the tin. She adjusted the tin and climbed the ladder and tried again. This time was a direct hit, filling the tin almost to the brim. And she even managed to keep her feet on the landing. Kendra brought the tin over to the silver bowl. She poured milk until the bowl was 3/4 of the way full. Only blood remained. Viola mooed thunderously, apparently upset at having her milk abruptly halted right after it began. "You're going to moo louder than that," Kendra muttered under her breath. How much blood would she need? The Fairy Queen had not specified quantities. Kendra went through the closet looking for tools. She ended up with a weed digger and another pie tin. Getting enough blood to pour from a pie tin into the bowl would be disgusting. But she was scared that if she tried to put blood from the source directly to the bowl, she would end up spilling everything. "Viola!" Kendra called. "I don't know if you can understand me. I need some of your blood in order to save Fablehaven. This might sting a little, so try to be brave." The cow gave no sign of comprehension. Kendra returned to the teat she had been milking. It was the one area not protected by fur, so she figured it would be the best place to harvest some blood. She climbed the ladder only a couple of steps. She wanted to stab the teat low so if it would drip. If she had found a knife, she would have tried to make a cut. The only thing sharp about the weed digger were the points at the end, so she would have to go with a puncture wound. Up close, as she contemplated stabbing it, the pink teat looked alien. She needed to stab hard. On an animal this big, the skin would be pretty thick. She told herself it would just be like a thorn to the enormous cow. But would she want somebody jabbing her thorn into her? The cow would probably get upset. Kendra raised the weed digger, holding the pie tin in her other hand. "Sorry, Viola," she yelled, plunging the weed digger into the spongy flesh. The tool sank almost to the handle, and Viola made a terrifying bellow. The heavy teat swung into Kendra, slamming her off the ladder. She kept hold of the weed digger, wrenching it free from the wound as she fell. The ladder clattered to the floor beside her. Viola sidestepped and tossed her head and bellowed again. The barn shook, and Kendra heard timber splitting. The roof shuddered. The walls swayed and cracked. Kendra covered her head. Gigantic hoofs thumped against the floor, and Viola let out a long, plaintive moo. Then the cow settled down. Kendra looked up. Dust and hay floated down from above. Blood trickled from the teat, already dripping from the tip. Since Viola had calmed down, the blood was flowing freely. Kendra cast aside the pie tin and retrieved the silver bowl. Standing under the teat, she started catching drops of blood. She had toured a cave with her family once, and the sight reminded her of water dripping from a stalactite. Soon, the mixture in the bowl turned from white to pink. The flow of the blood slowed. The lower side and tip of the teat were stained red. Kendra supposed it was enough. She went and sat by the little door. Now, for her blood. Maybe she could just try the cow blood and see that worked. No, haste was essential. How would she get blood out? No way was she using a weed digger unless she could sterilize it. Leaving the bowl, she hunted through the closets again. She noticed a safety pin on a pair of coveralls. She unpinned it and ran back to the bowl. Holding her hand over the bowl, she hesitated. Kendra had always hated needles. The idea of being fully aware that something was about to hurt, but having to endure it calmly. But today was not a day to be squeamish. Gritting her teeth, she stuck her thumb with a pin, then squeezed 2 drops of blood into the mixture. That would have to do. Kendra looked at the pie tin. She should probably drink some milk herself, since a new day was beginning. She took a sip. Then she realized that her family would need milk as well when she found them. There had been bottled water in one of the closets. Kendra hurried to the closet, selected a bottle, unscrewed the cap, dumped the contents, and filled it with milk from the pie tin. The bottle barely fit in her pocket. Kendra received the small silver bowl. Swirling the solution a bit, she exited the barn. Pre-dawn colors streaked the horizon. Sunrise was approaching. Now what? There were no fairies in sight. When the fairy queen had given instructions, Kendra had felt no doubt that the handmaidens she referred to were the fairies. She was supposed to make a potion for them that would somehow get them to help her. What would it do? Kendra realized that she had no idea. What could it do? When their infection? Then what? Lacking other options, she had to trust the reassurance she had felt when the queen fairy spoke to her mind. First, she needed to find the fairies. She wandered the garden. There was one, clad in orange and black with matching butterfly wings. "Hey, fairy, I have something for you," she cried. The fairy darted over to her, looked at the bowl, started chirping in a squeaky voice, and zoomed away. Kendra roamed until she found another fairy. It ended up with the identical reaction. The fairy acted excited and then flew away. Soon, multiple fairies were flying up to Kendra, peeking in the bowl and soaring off. They were apparently spreading the news. Kendra ended up beside the metal statue of Dell. She set the bowl on the ground and backed away, in case her proximity might discourage the fairies. The morning grew brighter. Before long, dozens of fairies hovered around the bowl. They were no longer showing up only to zip away. A crowd was forming. Occasionally, one would fly right up to the bowl and peer inside. One even laid a tiny hand on the rim, but none took a drink. Most stayed several feet away. The crowd swelled to more than 100. Still, they would not drink. Kendra tried to be patient. She did not want to frighten them away. Suddenly, the sound of a mighty wind interrupted the quiet morning. Kendra felt no breeze, but she could hear a shrieking gale in the distance. As the sound of the wind tapered off, a ferocious roar echoed across the yard. The fairies scattered. It could only mean one thing. "Wait, please, you have to drink this. Your queen had me make it for you." The fairies darted around in confusion. "Hurry, time is running out." Whether it was her words or simply that they were no longer startled, the fairies gathered around the bowl again. "Try it," Kendra said. "Have a taste." None of the fairies took her up on the offer. Kendra dipped a finger in the bowl and sampled the elixir. She tried not to make a disgusting face. It tasted salty and nasty. Delicious. A fairy with raven black hair and bumblebee wings approached the bowl. Mimicking Kendra, she dipped her finger and tasted it. In a whirling shower of sparks, the fairy grew to nearly 6 feet tall. Kendra smelled the fertile aroma that had accompanied the fairy queen. The enlarged fairy blinked in astonishment, then glided high into the air. The other fairies mobbed the bowl. A blizzard of sparks flashed across the yard as the fairies transformed into much larger versions of themselves. Kendra backed away, shielding her eyes from the dazzling pyrotechnics. In moments, she was surrounded by a glorious host of human-sized fairies, some standing on the ground, most hovering. The fairies were uniformly tall and beautiful, with the lithe musculature of a professional ballerinas. They wore vivid, exotic apparel. They still had magnificent wings. They still emitted light, although the gentle twinkle had become a brilliant blaze. The biggest change was in their eyes. Merry mischief had been replaced by something stern and smoldering. A fairy with lustrous silver wings and short blue hair alighted in front of Kendra. "You have summoned us to war," she announced in a heavy accent. "What is your bidding?" Kendra swallowed. 100 human-sized fairies took up much more space than 100 tiny ones. They used to be so cute. Now they were quite imposing. She would not want to be the enemy of these proud seraphim. "Can you restore Dell?" Kendra asked. A pair of fairies crouched over Dell, placed their hands on him, and then helped him to his feet. He regarded Kendra with befuddling wonder, patted himself as surprised as he was intact. "What's going on?" he said. "Where's Sam?" "The fairies healed you," Kendra said. "Grandpa and the others are still in trouble, but I think these fairies will help us." Kendra returned her gaze to the stunning silver fairy. "Muriel, the witch, is trying to release a demon named Bahumat. The demon is free," the fairy said. "You have but to command." Kendra pressed her lips together. "We have to lock him up again, the witch too, and we have to rescue my grandpa and grandma Sorensen and my brother Seth and Lena." The blue fairy nodded and issued instructions in a musical language. Some of the fairies began rummaging in nearby plants. They pulled out weapons. A yellow fairy produced a crystal sword from the soil of a flower bed. A violet fairy transformed a thorn from a rose bush into a spear. A silver fairy with blue hair changed a snail shell into a beautiful shield. The petal of a pansy became a blazing axe in her other hand. "This is your will," the silver fairy confirmed. "Yes," Kendra said firmly. All together, the fairies took flight. Kendra turned to watch them go. Then a hand grabbed her left arm and another seized her right, and she was soaring between two fairies, a slender albino with black eyes and a blue furry fairy. Kendra recognized the blue one as the downy fountain sprite she had seen in Grandpa's office. The sudden acceleration took her breath away. They cruised low to the ground, skimming over bushes, dodging tree trunks, and swishing past branches. Flying near to the rear, Kendra marveled at the squadron of fairies ahead of her, effortlessly weaving through obstacles at such reckless speed. The exhilaration was overwhelming. The wind of their velocity brought tears to her eyes. The pond, with their gazebos, streaked by beneath her. At this rate, they would reach the forgotten chapel in moments. But what about when they got there? Bahumat was supposed to be incredibly powerful. Even so, considering the legion of fierce fairies surrounding her, Kendra liked her odds. Glancing back, Kendra saw no fairies behind her. They had apparently left Dell in the yard. The mad dash through the forest continued until the fairies ahead swooped skyward. Kendra's escorts followed, rocketed up beyond the treetops. The sudden ascent left her mouth dry and stomach tingling. And then she was no longer moving. Kendra and her escorts hovered above the treetops, watching the others plunge toward the forgotten chapel. Kendra tried to recover from the thrill of flying and digest what was happening below. Four winged creatures were rising to meet the fairies. The huge gargoyles were at least 10 feet tall, with razor claws and horns like rams. A few fairies broke off from the main group to intercept them. The winged beasts claw at their smaller opponents, but the fairies adroitly evaded the blows and slashed off their wings, sending the gargoyles hurtling to the ground. Something flashed in Kendra's eyes. The sun was peeking over the horizon. "Let's go," Kendra said to her escorts. The fairies dove. Kendra felt her stomach rise to her throat as they plunged towards the church. Human-sized imps were spilling out of the front doorway, shaking their fists and hissing at the incoming fairies. Many of the fairies cast their weapons aside and soared straight at the imps. catching them in vicious embraces and kissing them on the mouth. In radiant bursts of sparks, every imp that was kissed transformed into a human-sized fairy. Kendra saw the silver fairy with the blue hair plant a kiss on an obese imp. The imp instantly metamorphosed into a plump fairy with coppery wings. As the silver fairy glided away, the plump fairy tackled another imp, forced a kiss, and in a flash, the imp became a thin, Asian-looking fairy with hummingbird wings. The fairies streamed into the church. Most did not bother with the door. They glided through windows or smashed through the corroded roof. Kendra's escorts held her over a gap in the roof. She saw fairies kissing imps. The other fairies dove back a variety of foul beasts. One fairy used a golden lash to send a toad-like monstrosity crashing through the wall. Another fairy grasped a scabby beast by its mane of white hair and hurled it through a window. A gray fairy with moth-like wings chased a brawny minotaur out the front door with a scalding blast of steam from the end of her rod. Many of the unsavory creatures voluntarily fled before the terrible onslaught. Others fought back. A demonic dwarf with a hide of black scales bounded around the room, wreaking havoc with a pair of knives. A rampaging atrocity that looked like a cross between a bear and an octopus battered fairies with its thrashing tentacles. A greasy creature coughed globs of slime into the air. It had the general appearance of a large tortoise without a shell, its body an amoeboid puddle beneath a long neck. Several fairies crashed to the church floor, wings snarled in goopy substance. The undaunted fairies counterattacked. The bottom half of a dwarf was turned to a stone. Tentacles severed, the octobear retreated. A torrent of water flushed away the greasy creature. Some fairies attended their fallen comrades, healing injuries and washing away slime. As the room cleared, fairies charged the door to the basement. "Take me to the basement," Kendra said. Her escorts immediately responded, nearly giving Kendra a whiplash as they plummeted into the church and glided to the basement door. The fairies had to tuck in their wings to descend the stairs, so Kendra ran down beside the furry fairy and the albino. The basement had expanded. A massive excavation and renovation had occurred. It was deeper, broader, and longer. The alcove at the far side had grown as well, now completely unfettered by knotted ropes. The basement was not lighted as brightly as before, although the fairies carried their own luminescence with them. Hideous carvings sneered from the walls. One corner was piled with strange treasures, jade idols, spiked scepters, and jeweled masks. Kendra scanned the room for her family. The easiest to spot was Seth. He was inside an enormous jar with breathing holes punched in the lid. There were some leaves and branches in it with him. He had grown no taller, but he looked 100 years old. Saggy wrinkles creased his face, and he had only a few wisps of white hair left atop his head, his face a plumed palm against the glass. Kendra guessed that the orangutan chained to the wall was Grandpa. The large catfish swimming in the tank beside him was probably Lena. She saw no sign of Grandma. Flanked by her fairy escorts, Kendra dashed toward her family. Scores of hideous imps scuffled with fairies. Those fights did not last long as kisses transformed the imps back into their original forms. Kendra reached the gigantic jar. "Are you all right, Seth?" Her elderly brother nodded feebly. His smile showed that he had no teeth.